At long last, I get a chance to weather a steam locomotive using mostly Ammo by Mig's oil brushers, coming up on JC's Rip Track. Hi there, my name is John and welcome to JC's Rip Track. If this is your first time here, this channel is all about advice and tips on transforming your plastic models into something that looks like it belongs on the rails today. If you want to follow along, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can receive a notification every time there's a new video. So how many of you model the steam era? Do you weather your locomotives? What sort of weathering did you do for them? Let me know in the comments section below. Virtually all of the work that I've done on this channel has been in the diesel era. Still, a significant number of model railroaders have fabulous layouts that feature the great steam-powered locomotives of yesteryear. Rick Stoneking of the YouTube channel The SwitchList allowed me to shift my weathering gears into this era and try some new and different techniques. Rick commissioned me to weather an HO scale Baldwin 460 steam locomotive based on a prototype that saw service on the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railway, locomotive number 27, that was built in 1906. It served there on the railroad until it was retired in 1955. As Rick's layout is set in 1947, the locomotive is about 8 years away from when it was taken out of service, so that the weathering would help tell that story. My instructions from Rick were to have this as a medium weathering job, and most of the photos seem to support that kind of look. So not a rust bucket, but reasonably well worn. Still, there was an additional challenge in researching weathering on a steam locomotive, as all of the prototype photos for this locomotive were in black and white. A significant obstacle in accurately weathering locomotives from these earlier periods is the lack of color photographs. It is clear that the locomotive has some degree of weathering on it, but it's unclear what kind and what color. So I had to do some more research, finding some color reference photographs of other steam locomotives. I also took an up-close and personal look at the iron horses serving at Heritage Park Historical Village in Calgary to get an idea of what sort of weathering one could expect on these fantastic beasts. The latter is a little bit more challenging, as most steam locomotives in operating condition today are also likely to be kept in near factory fresh state, restored as historical artifacts. And even then, there are still hints about where they would weather and what that might look like on the open rails. So let's get started. I decided to use Ammo by Mig's oil brushers for this project for many of the weathering steps. You'll see how I was able to use them in different ways throughout the entire video. When I first receive a model, I like to pull it out for an initial look, even if I've seen pictures of it ahead of time. This inspection helps me develop the hands-on weathering plan, even if I've already had time to research the prototype. After opening the box and digging it out of the foam chips, I could then get it out of its original packaging and have a look. One thing that would be increasingly clear is that I would have to be much more careful with electrical conductivity and moving parts during the weathering process. Steam locomotives consist of the locomotive for power and the tender for fuel and water. They are two separate pieces that make up a functioning whole, and they can't work without the other. Even though model railroad steam locomotives are entirely electrical, many of them are also built in the same way. They cannot operate independently of each other. This HO scale Baldwin 460 from Bachmann is no different. All of the wheels have electrical pickup, including the ones on the tender, and the tender also carries the decoder, and they are linked together with a bus wire plug that can be separated and worked on individually. However, with all of the electrical pickups and connections on the tenders and locomotive's underside, I would need a bit of masking, not just on the windows, but on these parts as well. I removed the wheels from the tender, masking off the metal brushes that make contact with the axles, and then put some tape over the connector plugs to keep it clean from when I would be applying clear coats with an airbrush. Since the cab is open, I would need to mask the windows from both sides. For the cab interior, I used a bit of Tamiya masking tape. A precise application was less critical here, but I made sure to cover the windows so that any spraying would not accumulate inside of the cab windows. The exterior windows, on the other hand, needed to be more precise. Using the foil masking method that I've now used on a few models, I masked off the side window exteriors, carefully burnishing the mask down to the details and trimming away the excess. The front porthole windows were a bit too deep for the foil masking method to work, so I had to use the Tamiya masking tape there, which I cut into smaller pieces and carefully applied around the edges of the window. The main goal of masking is to produce a good cover and clean lines. It's the same whether using the foil wrapper method or masking tape. Either method works, it's whatever gets the job done. And once I finished all the masking, it was on to the weathering. The locomotive was a clean black with no fading at all. And for a locomotive with light to moderate weathering, fading is an essential early step. Since I would be using Ammo by MIG oil brushers for this, I decided that a satin clear coat would serve me best, as it would be smooth enough to allow the oils to blend, but toothy enough to allow for some staining on the surface. The satin clear coat here was a 10-to-1 mix of Pledge Revive It, or Future as it was once known, and 1 part Tamiya flat base. I pre-mixed it before the video as it sometimes takes a little bit of finessing to get it right. Dot fading using oil paints is an effective way of achieving a realistic faded look. Over the past year, I've started using Ammo by MIG's oil brushers for doing this for 2 main reasons. 1, it comes in pre-mixed colors that are ideal for this kind of work. And 2, the built-in brushes and paint consistency speed up the process substantially. For this process, I used medium gray, white, buff, Starship Filth, and black. And for the mostly monochrome nature of the Steam Locomotive, these would work well. Fading and weathering black can be challenging, but these colors and methods can achieve a realistic look reasonably quickly. As I would be doing the cab interior later, I would only be doing the outside of the locomotive and tender. I had my painting palette on hand for odorless thinners poured into 2 wells, mainly for the blending step, but just in case I would need it for this step, I had it poured out. Fortunately, the oil brushers come ready to use, which made the whole process far quicker. Starting with the medium gray, I used the oil brusher directly out of the bottle. I made sure to brush off the excess around the edge of the cap and the thin bottle's internal burrs so that there wasn't too much on the built-in brush. I then proceeded to add dots across the model, mainly keeping the dots spread out on the surface, including the trucks. I applied this first to the tender and then over the locomotive itself, and I made sure that I had an even spread of these dots, as the gray would provide the general fade color. The oil brushers go a long way. I didn't need to re-dip the brush at all during this step, and it would be the one that I used the most amount of paint. Following the gray, I then used a small amount of white across the top of the locomotive and tender. Unfortunately, on the top of the cab, I ended up with a couple blobs of white because I hadn't made sure to remove the excess from the built-in brush. I would have to clean this up when I moved to blend the dot fade, but I did have more work to do. The next color I used was buff, which would add a dirtier look to the dot fade. I interspersed the dots from this oil brusher across the roof, walkways, and on top of the locomotive. Like the white, I used just a few dots in strategic places to warm up the tones in the blend. Moving on to the darker colors, I used Starship Filth. I have this as both a tube paint and as an oil brusher, and while the colors are slightly different, the overall look is a dark, dirty gray. I applied a few dots from this oil brusher across the model with a higher concentration on the lower parts near the recesses to emphasize shadows. This process would end up creating a subtle gradient when blended. Lastly, I used the black oil brusher on the lower parts and around the forward gray area on the smokebox, which would also help emphasize detail. After I finished this, I moved on to the blending step right away. The dots on the tender had dried enough and the locomotive would be ready by the time that I finished with it. Like standard dot fades with tube-based oils, I used a downward stroke using a flat brush soaked in thinner. I would rinse the brush in one pool of thinner in one well of my palette, brushing it off, and then re-wetting it in the clean thinner and continuing on with the blending process. Starting on the flat top of the tender, I started in the middle and blended out. And I sought to avoid pooling, which meant wicking up the excess thinner after I had finished with the blending on the sides. This step goes by fairly quickly, and while one can't appreciate the full effect until it dries, you can see how the blending starts giving the model character. Creating dot fades this way has a nice side effect of having a pigment from the fade collect around some of the details, which brings them out and helps create the illusion of size. Once I finished the tender, it was onto the locomotive. My first task was to reduce the blobs of white on the top of the cab that I had accidentally applied earlier. Here it was more pigment removal. I spread more thinner on than I usually do. I then dried the brush on a paper towel and used the dried bristles to wick up the excess. I had to draw the brush across the roof one way and then across the other. And once I was happy with how much I had removed, I could then continue with the blending step by manipulating anything that remained on the top of the cab and then carry it on through the rest of the locomotive as usual. The white Oilbrusher pigment is quite intense, so I went through and manually pulled off about half of the pigment from the other white dots on the locomotive before blending the rest of it. Blending was straightforward, working from the middle of the top and the boiler and then down the sides until all of the dots just disappeared. I picked up some of the excess pigment that had added to the cab's front and where I hadn't applied any dots at all. On this steam locomotive, the boiler's rounded shape lends itself well to this kind of fade, as the downward streak effect that comes with this technique creates a subtle streaked grime look. I had to be careful around the drive wheels to cover everything and ensure that the weathering that I did wouldn't gum up the operating parts. I'm not skilled enough with the locomotive construction to have dismantled these parts, so I elected it to weather them in place. As a final touch, I used a dry sponge across the top of the model to soften any brush marks that I wasn't happy with. But I would let it dry to see how the fading looked, and once I was happy with it, it was on to the next steps. To prepare for the pinwash steps, I needed a good clear coat. Clear gloss acrylic was my choice here. These days, Future is now known as Pledge Revive It. I thinned it with a bit of 91% alcohol and sprayed it across the locomotive and the tender and let it dry. This clear coat would give a nice smooth surface for the next oil-based pin wash, and the acrylic layer would prevent the thinner from the next step attacking the oil work that I had just done in the fading step. Pin washes are a good way to help draw attention to details in the model by creating contrast points around them. If the fading step was to lighten the overall model, the pin wash helps create contrast around the details. Sticking with the oil brushers, I used Starship Filth, but this time instead of using it straight out of the model, I mixed the wash on my paint palette. I put a bit of paint into one of the wells, added a bit of thinner by scooping it from the adjacent well where I previously added some, and then mixed it together. This type of wash behaves precisely the same as a pin wash made from oil from a tube or a pre-made mix. If anything though, it is a little easier to get the consistency right because oil brusher paints are already thinner than tube-based paints. I then applied some clean thinner across the model with a larger brush, making sure that the pin wash would flow in and around the model's recesses by capillary action. Using a much smaller brush, I applied the created wash to the points of raised detail across both models. Anything from rivets to piping to panel lines and ribs, any place the textures and details change. The wash would wick up around and hug the details, giving them a needed contrast to draw an observer's eye across the model and help them appreciate the detail. On a model this dark, the pin wash is a challenging thing to see on camera, but it did create the look what I was looking for. Even so, I would have to let it dry and then soften any tide marks with the next step. When using an oil-based pin wash, softening tide marks and edges around the detail is a necessary step. As I have described before, after letting the pin wash dry for about 20 minutes, I take a completely dry brush and try to massage and soften any noticeable tide marks on the model. Tide marks are the term that I use to describe places where the liquid thinner has dried and left pigment on a flat surface of the model in the shape of the liquid. With oil and enamel-based washes, this effect can be easily blended out and softened, leaving the pigment where it needs to be around the model's details and a soft edge around it. More subtly, this also creates a gradient effect between the surfaces and detail points. Since the next step would be chipping with acrylic paints, I needed a flat clear coat to prepare the surface. To me, a flat clear thinned with a bit of 91% alcohol was my clear coat for this step. While this locomotive would not be seeing an extensive amount of weathering, paint does tend to wear and break down. Like the S4 switcher that I did in an earlier video, I found the Games Workshop's Skaven Blight Dinge and Storm Vermin Fur are nice dirty gray colors when applied with a sponge, and they can give a realistic chipping effect to black surfaces. I use these sparingly in places across the model, mostly on surfaces where the crew would be working on the engine and some parts of the model that are wood in real life. The trick with sponge chipping is that you dab the sponge in the paint and then dab most of it off onto a piece of paper towel. And it's true no matter what color that you're using. This chipping step would also be the first stage of painting the cab interior. In consulting with Rick, he wanted the cab interior to remain black, as it seems that many of the Maryland and Pennsylvania kept the colors across the model. Some railroads have adopted green interior cabs for this, but the Ma and Pa did not. So I didn't have to do a full repaint of the interior. After I finished with the black, it was time to do rust chipping with my standard colors of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown. In many of the period prototypes that I've seen, these parts of the locomotive often get hot enough that whatever paint is applied to them quickly breaks down and the surface of the metal soon oxidizes, making for a mottled, rusty surface. So this is less about environmental rust and more about the heat damage that comes from the locomotive itself. I applied Mournfang Brown first with a sponge, although I had to use tweezers to get the sponge into places where my fingers were just too big. I even had to go so far as to use a micro brush to get into the areas that the sponge could not reach into. Micro brushes are often used to apply solvents, and their heads are nowhere close enough for any sort of precise paint application. They resemble more of a small, spiny ball than a conventional brush. I dab most of the excess paint off on a paper towel and apply them to parts of the model in the same way that I would apply a sponge. Apply paint to the applicator, dab a lot of it off on a piece of paper towel, and then dab it on the model. The microbrushers were especially helpful when applying the rust to the firebox underneath the cab, behind the rear drive wheels. I didn't want any rust on the driver wheels, so the narrower but rough tip of the applicator worked very well for this job. I applied some very light rust chips along the exterior in places that I chipped away with the black. Still, I was cautious to avoid areas that was modeled as wood, which would destroy the illusion of realistic looking rust. A very light touch was vital here. Single dabs from a nearly dry sponge would provide enough of the look that I was aiming for. As a final flourish, I used a tiny amount of Scrag Brown on a micro brush or the sponge to create some accented lighter colors of rust to enhance what was already in place. I glanced over the model, spotted a few places that I wanted to add a little bit more, and then I finished it up and it was on to the next step. Inside the cab, the boiler has several dials and levers molded into it that would be lost if I left the whole thing looking rusty. These parts are separate from the boiler in real life, but they also need to stand out for crews to be able to read them. It is a detail that an observer would notice when looking into the back of the cab, adding some color to it, drawing the eye to it, and then enhancing the look. I first picked out the details with a fine brush and Thamar black. This process is called blacking down. Doesn't matter the type of paint that you use, but the black helps sharpen the lines and distinguishes the details from the colors around it. It also has a benefit because some of the paints that I would be using are metallic acrylics, which would benefit nicely from a black undercoat. Once I picked out the details that I wanted with the black, it was now time to add bits of color. One of the elements was a dial with a large face, and using a little bit of acrylic white paint, I carefully painted the front of the dial, leaving a black rim to distinguish it from the rest of the background. I painted the whole dial white, including the needle, to make the red paint that would come next easier to apply. After the dial, I then used the white paint to paint anything on the model that would eventually be red to stand out against the darker background. Red acrylic paints tend to be thin, and it takes some time and effort to make them cover well. So instead, I provided a white base over which I could paint the red, and that would be much easier. I also used black paint to paint the outside frame of the glass shields that extend out beyond the windows, as these are clear plastic molded parts on the model, and I wanted to match what I was able to see on the prototype. These steps, because they were acrylic, dried quickly, and I was able to move on to the metallic colors. Starting with a dark iron color called Lead Belcher from Games Workshop, I provided a metallic base to it, but it didn't turn out as well in the videos that I had just off camera as I was applying it. It would be more visible in the next steps. Next, I used Balthasar Gold, another metallic paint, to provide the base for various brass bits and pieces across the model. It has a very brassy, coppery look that would also provide a good base for any brass or copper parts, not just inside the cab, but also in various places around the model. I also had to carefully touch paint to multiple details as they were tiny and wouldn't need much at all. Outside of the cab, I wanted to use a little bit of the color to add some visual interest, especially around the detailed tubing and fittings outside of the boiler, rather than just having it all black. These points of color help draw the eye to the details and show the different metals used in these sophisticated machines. It would also allow me to show that other metals corrode differently, especially brass and copper. But first, I had to get the base metal finished. The last part of this step was to use the red acrylic paint to pick out the various knob handles and levers that I had already painted white inside the cab, and one or two valves on the outside of the locomotives, giving a tiny accent of red here and there. Lastly, I picked out the dial indicator with red, and it was on to an acrylic wash. When I work on models like this, I use oil-based washes to pull out the detail, but for the cab this time around, I wanted to use an acrylic as I also wanted to unify the colors. I've used acrylic washes for miniature painting for years, and I like how they work for figures. Since the boiler was rounded and textured, I thought that it could benefit from this kind of wash. For something like this, my favorite is a shade color from Games Workshop called Agrax Earthshade. It's pre-mixed and you can apply it straight out of the bottle. It dries mostly matte, which is what I needed for this step. Using an acrylic wash is a one-step process. You slop it on with a larger brush, dry the brush out, and then wick up any excess pooling of the liquid and then let it dry. My orders from Rick was a light to medium weathering job so that the rust would be a light touch, but I also get a chance to do a type of metal corrosion that I've never demonstrated before, verdigris. When iron or steel corrodes, it creates the signature brown, orange, red colors of rust that we are familiar with. On the other hand, copper or brass does something very different. It goes a turquoise green in various stages and places. And even though I would be doing this as a light touch, I would be using oil paints to handle the rust and the verdigris. If you are observing, I pulled out the oil paints, but the locomotive still has a matte coat on it. I'm not doing streaks, but rather rust stains on surfaces, and the verdigris would be around tiny details. When I made this, I had yet to acquire the Rust Colors Oilbrushers, so that my tube paints I had to use for this step. However, this could be easily done with Oilbrushers if you have them. For the rust, I dipped the tip of a small brush into the end of the oil tube, and then I placed a few dots in a few places along the walkways, the pistons, the side rods, the boiler sides, and on the roof, anywhere that there would be a considerable amount of steam or rainfall, and where condensed water would collect and start oxidizing the iron and steel. Some of these dots I applied along the edges where water might collect or take longer to dry. I then did the same dot application with the light rust oil paint, focusing around the boiler, and even then I applied less than 7 dots of this light rust color. After applying the dots, I then used a completely dry deerfoot brush and massaged the pigment from each dot around where I had applied it. This technique gives a faint rust staining color with no real defined edges or chips, but rather a general kind of rust look. I did this very sparingly to give a hint of its age. Much of the pigment seems to disappear in the process, but it does leave a subtle staining effect, which is the look that I was going for. Once I finished the locomotive, I repeated the process across the tender, making sure to have some rust staining around the water spout just behind the coal pile and the sides of the trucks. The other type of corrosion, verdigris, is not something that I've shown before on this channel. Different metals corrode differently, and that corrosion has different colors. For iron and steel, it's the rust color we are familiar with. Aluminum tends to be a gray color that protects the surface, while for copper and its alloys, brass and bronze, it is various shades of bluish green. Since a considerable amount of steam locomotives construction involves copper pipe and brass fittings, this kind of corrosion is present, but in far fewer quantities than the large steel and iron structure. I decided to put a minimal amount of verdigris around what I had painted in the brass color in the earlier step to show a bit of aging. The pipes and valves, of course, are the focal point for this type of weathering. In real terms, adding verdigris to a model is just a pinwash of a different color. I used turquoise oil paint cut with a small amount of titanium white, thinned with odorless thinner. And I used a small brush to touch the various brass details, valve joints, or other places where the parts might come in contact with water or other oxidizing agents. These details are tiny and harder to see on camera, and some of them would include the steam whistle, any prominent brass parts that were stock on the model, plus the extra bits of piping that I had also done. On the left side of the locomotive, there were a series of pipes that, while black, are painted copper piping, so they would have some verdigris possibly showing through the paint. As with other pin washes of this type, softening the effect with a dry brush and drawing it down into streaks in places helped blend the effect with the model surface. The last part of this step was to take a graphite pencil and rubbing it along a few selected edges to create a metallic sheen to show where both rust and paint may have worn away, leaving exposed metal. The sides of the walkways and the trucks and the grab irons and steps on the locomotive and the tender are good candidates for this kind of effect. Looking at the tender early on in the process, I noticed that the model's coal load was way too clean looking. It's a molded pile of coal with clean edges where the tender's top partially encloses the fuel source. Look at any prototype picture and the top of the tender is strewn with bits of coal that overflows. In some prototype pictures, there's a wood barrier placed between this spot and the water spout. And while I wouldn't be adding a wood barrier, I decided that the coal load needed some improvements to make it look more realistic. Using a bit of matte Mod Podge, I poured a bit into my paint palette and then watered it down so the glue mixture would flow smoothly around where I would paint it. I then painted the mixture onto the coal load, especially around the edges and along the tender's front edge. I intentionally painted a ragged edge of the glue mixture, as I would then be sprinkling some black ballast into this area to start enhancing the look of the coal. After sprinkling it on, I then tapped off the excess into a folded piece of paper, and then this left a rough, more realistic looking pile of coal in the tender. After I tidied up the excess ballast, I then came back to the load and using a thicker brush, I dipped it into the glue mixture and then dabbed it on the top of the ballast that I had just applied and let it soak in. It strengthened the coal ballast, reducing the risk of any more grains being knocked loose after the whole thing had dried. And I had to be careful not to touch the ballast with the brush, as I didn't want to disturb what I had already put down. Once I finished this, I let it dry overnight before coming back to do some further enhancements. Before finishing off the ballast, I needed to add one small effect in a few places around the model. Steam locomotives aren't particularly fussy in the other major component of their power, water. Steam locomotives need both coal and water. Coal to fire the boiler and water to create the steam that makes it all move. Unless it is distilled water, all water has some sort of a mineral content to it, and for those of you who live in areas with hard water, you'll know exactly what that means. Limescale deposits are those minerals left behind when the steam evaporates and exits the locomotive in multiple places. To hint at this, a little bit of thinned down white oil paint drawn from the oil brusher looks great for this effect. I transferred a small amount of it to my painting palette where I could then use a much finer brush to apply it in a few key places. The consistency of the oil brusher is just right for this, not too thick, not too thin. I would then just add a small dot around valves, vents, pistons, including the whistle base, the top of the rear dome, or anywhere that you can see steam escaping from the prototype pictures. In a few places, I drew it down into some more distinctive streaks, especially to match the prototype pictures that I had access to, whether they were color or in black and white. I then used a dry flat brush to draw the dots into streaks and soften the larger streaks to give it a more realistic and consistent look. On the tender, before I finished the coal load, I wanted to show some limescale around the spout where the locomotives would receive water. Here, the look is a little different, as the evaporated water is not from heat, but rather the natural processes of water spilled on the top of the tender while loading. It still has the white color to it, so the difference is the look of how I applied it, specifically how I softened the dots. Instead of using a dry brush, I first used the same brush that I'd used to apply some odorless thinner to create it almost a wash. Usually I try to avoid puddling, but here that's precisely what I wanted to happen, as dried hard water stains look like that. In all of my weathering videos, you don't see me use weathering pigments all that often. Many modelers swear by them, and they are often the first things to reach for when weathering anything on a model railroad. Now, there's no right or wrong here, But there is one thing that pigments are much better at than most other mediums, and that's texture. As fine as pigments are, they create a textured look that oil or acrylic paints simply can't. And that's why they're perfect for doing the finishing touches on the coal load. I used the soot weathering pigment from Games Workshop's specialized Forge World line, but frankly any black pigment will do. Unlike the pigments from Monroe models, the ones I was using don't have an adhesive built into the mix, so I would have to take an extra step to lock them down. Scooping out a little bit of pigment into my oil paint palette tray, I then used a dry brush to apply it in and around the coal load, as well as the floor of the cab, massaging it in and across the edges of the coal load, and soften the edges of the ballast. I then drew the pigment across the coal load to provide some texture on the molded coal and the black ballast that is already on the model. It helped make this look like an actual pile of coal that is dirty and scattered across the tender's top. Pigments are well suited for this kind of weathering. After all, I tend to use the best tool for the job. However, one note of advice is that weathering pigments can be very messy, and they stick to all kinds of things more than just the model. Keep the pigments off of your fingers, as suddenly you'll be leaving unmistakable fingerprints everywhere. And while I didn't wear gloves for this task, you may wish to avoid that particular pitfall. A common problem with pigments is that they can disappear with the next clear coat. This becomes a matter of applying pigments, doing a clear coat, and then applying more pigments and repeating the process until the look is right. There's a chemical reason for this, especially if the pigments have a high chalk content that goes transparent when hit with a clear coat. One way to prevent this is to seal and to protect the pigments by using a dedicated pigment fixer. This fluid bonds with the pigment to the model without making it fade away after it dries. Pigment fixers can be applied either by brush or airbrush. If you're using an airbrush, make sure you spray it at a distance so that the blown air doesn't blow the pigment off the model. And do note that pigment fixers will make the pigments disappear when applied, but virtually all the previously used pigments will be visible once it is dry. When painted or airbrush, pigment fixers dry with a little bit of a sheen, so a flat coat is still required to tamp that down after it dries. However, they seal in the pigments so that clear coats don't make all of your hard work disappear. One also has to be careful to avoid tide marks with a fixer, but again, a flat clear coat can help that go away. As a tool for your arsenal, especially if you use pigments or powders regularly, consider getting some pigment fixer. I painted the facing of the tender wheels by hand using Stynylrez Red Brown. These wheels often have black paint, but for a locomotive the age of number 27, it is reasonable that the wheels, even if they've been replaced, would eventually be showing a consistent rusty brown. This process isn't too time consuming. I made sure only to paint the wheel facings, as the wheel still had to draw electricity from the track to power the unit. Once these had dried, I removed the masking tape underneath the tender and reassembled the wheels. The second last weathering step would be to add some soot stains around the smoke box and around the locomotive's top. I usually would do this with an airbrush. However, in doing some research at Heritage Park in Calgary, I found that the soot stains on the top of the locomotive looked waterlogged, for lack of a better term. The soot from the exhaust mixed with the steam from the blast pipe means that the water mixes with the soot, which then falls back down on the model, creating the texture not found on diesel locomotives. I decided to use a black gouache watercolor tube paint to handle this effect. I created a wash on my acrylic palette, thinning the paint to the water to the right consistency, and since I needed to break the surface tension down a little bit more, I used a bit of Golden Acrylic's wetting agent that you may have seen me use in previous videos. It needs to be relatively thin, as this is a subtle effect. I painted this thin mixture across the locomotive's top areas and then used my empty airbrush to dry the paint. Once I finished, I went back with the dry brush to massage the pigment further. In a few places, I dampened the brush with a little bit of water to reactivate the gouache paint to get it to blend further if need be. Gouache paints, while watercolors, have properties that feel like a hybrid of oil and acrylic paints. Ralph Renzetti, the Mudfather, uses them to great effect when weathering, and for the look that I was aiming for here, they were definitely the right choice. Before reassembling the locomotive, I removed the mast from the inside and outside of the locomotive and the various electrical components. After consulting with Rick, he asked for a little bit of dust on the model as a final touch. The rest of the weathering in the locomotive is from general wear and tear from the locomotive being a steam unit, but dust is a consistent reality across any era. To make it consistent with the prototype pictures that Rick and I were working with, most of the dust would be on the sides and back of the tender and the cab and the walkways of the locomotive, with a little bit around the piston assemblies. To achieve this effect, I use the medium soil oil brusher over a flat coat. Typically, I apply oils over a gloss coat, but because this is a staining effect, the toothy surface of a matte finish provided me with the surface that I needed. I used the built-in brush, but made sure to wipe off most of the paint to control the amount going on the model. Starting with the tender, I applied a ragged thin line across the places that I wanted to have the effect, which looked more like a series of dots. I then immediately took a deerfoot type brush that was dry and massaged the pigment into the model surface, working it up so that the dust look was more pronounced towards the lower and rear parts, but still came up the sides a little bit, sort of blending into the top. The first task is to smear the dots around a bit and then draw the pigment and blend it up in a circular scrubbing motion. I continued this process, working each face back and forth with the medium soil oil brusher, doing the same on the trucks, and coming up with a dust pattern consistent with an active, moving locomotive. Once I finished the tender, I did the same for the locomotive, collecting the dust towards the cab edges, the tops of the walkways, and some around the pistons and the lower front of the locomotive. When I finished this step, I sent the final pictures to Rick for his approval, and then it was time to send Ma and Pa number 27 home. When the locomotive arrived home, Rick sent me a short clip of the locomotive in action on his own layout. It's nice to see like this come to life on somebody else's layout. If you want to see more of this in action, as well as what Rick is up to, then go and check out his YouTube channel at the SwitchList. I've included links for it both below and in the upper corner of this video. And a big shout out to Rick Stoneking for the pleasure and privilege of sharing with you the first steam locomotive weathered on this channel. Some things are consistent across the board when it comes to weathering. However, because steam locomotives operate in a fundamentally different way than diesels do, some of the weathering patterns will be different. The key to remember for steam locomotives is coal and water, and the machinery to manipulate them will yield a very different look. While rust and dust may be the same, line scale, wet soot, verdigris, and coal dust are all things that are distinctive when weathering steam locomotives. So I hope you found this as a helpful guide for your steam and locomotive weathering projects. Rick's locomotive counts as a medium weathering job, as even steam locomotives towards the end of their operational lives benefited from the constant maintenance that's required. So if you want more tips on how to get the most out of your weathering and painting projects, don't forget to hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you won't miss any upcoming videos. If you haven't already, check out the other videos on this channel and some of the social media links below. Also, if you like seeing how Rick's commission went and you want a chance to see how one of your own might look, go check out my Patreon page and you can get involved in the creative process for this channel. So thanks so much for watching. Good luck, and may you keep on track.